Hello everyone, and welcome to a new segment I like to call Storytime with Lucifer. Basically, I was inspired by Mr. Creepypasta. If you don't know who he is, go check him out on YouTube if you like scary stories or any other kind of stories. He's really good. He inspired me to do this. Anyways, I'm just going to be reading through short stories or any books I might have on my shelf. What we're going to be starting with is a classic that I've wanted to read aloud for a long time. And it is called The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. And I'm going to be reading the prologue and a little bit of Chapter 1. The opera ghost really existed. He was not, as was long believed, a creature of the imagination of the artists, the superstition of the managers, or a product of the absurd and impressionable brains of the young ladies of the ballet, their mothers, the box-keepers, the cloakroom attendants, or the concierge. Yes, he existed in flesh and blood, although he assumed the complete appearance of a real phantom, that is to say, of a spectral shade. When I began to ransack the archives of the National Academy of Music, I was at once struck by the surprising coincidences between the phenomena ascribed to the ghost and the most extraordinary and fantastic tragedy that ever excited the Paris upper classes, and I soon conceived the idea that this tragedy might not reasonably be explained by the phenomena in question. These events do not date more than 30 years back, and it would not be difficult to find at the present day, in the foyer of the ballet, old men of the highest respectability, men upon whose word could absolutely rely, who would remember, as though they happened yesterday, the mysterious and dramatic conditions that attended the kidnapping of Christine Daae, the disappearance of the Vicomte de Chagny, and the death of his elder brother, Count Philip. His body was found on the bank of the lake that exists in the lower cellars of the Opera, on the Rue Scribe side. But none of those witnesses had until that day thought that there was any reason for connecting the more or less legendary figure of the opera ghost with that terrible story. The truth was slow to enter my mind, puzzled by an inquiry that at the moment was very complicated by events which, at first sight, might be looked upon as superhuman, and more than once I was within an ace of abandoning a task in which I was exhausting myself in the hopeless pursuit of a vain image. At last I received the proof that my presentiments had not deceived me, and I was rewarded for all of my efforts on the day when I acquired the certainty that the opera ghost was more than a mere shade. On that day I had spent long hours over the memoirs of a manager, the light and frivolous work of the too skeptical Montcalm, who, during his term at the opera, understood nothing of the mysterious behavior of the ghost, and who was making all the fun of it that he could at the moment, when he became the first victim of a curious financial operation that went on inside the magic envelope. I had just left the library in despair when I met the delightful acting manager of our National Academy, who stood chatting on a landing with a lively and well-groomed little old man, to whom he introduced me gaily. The acting manager knew all about my investigations, and how eagerly and unsuccessfully I had been trying to discover the whereabouts of the examining magistrate in the famous Chagny case, Monsieur Farrell. Nobody knew what had become of him, alive or dead, and here he was, back from Canada, where he had spent 15 years, and the first thing he had done, on his return to Paris, was to come to the secretarial offices at the opera and ask for a free seat. The little old man was Monsieur Farrell himself. We spent a good part of the evening together, and he told me the whole Chagny case as he understood it at the time. He was bound to conclude in favor of the madness of the Viscount and the accidental death of the elder brother, for lack of evidence at the contrary. But he was nevertheless persuaded that a terrible tragedy had taken place between the two brothers in connection with Christine Daae. He could not tell me what became of Christine or the Vicomte. When I mentioned the ghost, he only laughed. He, too, had been told of the curious manifestations that seemed to point to the existence of an abnormal being residing in one of the most mysterious corners of the opera. And he knew the story of the envelope, but he had never seen anything in it worthy of his attention, as magistrate in charge of the Chagny case, and it was as much as he had done to listen to the evidence of a witness who appeared of his own accord and declared that he had often met with the ghost. This witness was none other than the man whom all Paris called the Persian, and who was well known to every subscriber to the opera. The magistrate took him for a visionary. I was immensely interested by the story of the Persian. I wanted, if there was still time, to find this valuable and eccentric witness. My luck began to improve, and I discovered him in this little flat in the Rue de Rivoli, where he had lived ever since and where he died 5 months after my visit. I was first inclined to be suspicious, but when the Persian had told me, with childlike candor, all that he knew about the ghost, and had handed me proofs of the ghost's existence, including the strange correspondent of Christine Daae, to do as I pleased with, I was no longer able to doubt. No, the ghost was not a myth. I have, I know, been told that this correspondence may have been forged from first to last by a man whose imagination had certainly been fed on the most seductive tales. But fortunately I discovered some of Christine's writings outside of a famous bundle of letters, and, on a comparison between the two, all of my doubts were removed. I also went into the past history of the Persian, and found that he was an upright man, incapable of inventing a story that might have defeated the ends of justice. This, moreover, was the opinion of more serious people who, at one time or another, were mixed up in the Cheny case, and who were friends of the Cheny family, to whom I had showed all of my documents and set forth all of my inferences. In this connection, I should like to print a few lines which I received from General D. Sir, I cannot urge you too strongly to publish the results of your inquiry. I remember perfectly that, a few weeks before the disappearance of the great singer Christine Daae, and the tragedy which threw the whole of Faubourg Saint-Germain into mourning, there was a great deal of talk, in the foyer of the ballet, on the subject of ghosts, and I believe that it only ceased to be discussed in consequence of the later affair that excited us all so greatly. But if it be possible, as after hearing you I believe, to explain the tragedy through the ghost, then I beg you, sir, to talk to us about the ghost again. Mysterious though the ghost may at first appear, he will always be more easily explained than the dismal story in which the malevolent people have tried to picture two brothers killing each other who had worshipped each other all of their lives. Believe me, etc., etc. Lastly, with a bundle of papers in hand, I once more went over to the ghost's vast domain, the huge building which he had made his kingdom. All of my eyes saw, all that my mind perceived, corroborated the Persian's documents precisely, and what a wonderful discovery crowned my labors in a very definite fashion. It will be remembered that later, when digging in the substructure of the opera, before burying the phonographic records of the artist's voice, the workman laid bare a corpse. Well, I was at once able to prove that this corpse was that of the opera ghost. I made the acting manager put this proof to the test with his own hand, and it is now a matter of supreme indifference to me if the papers pretend that the body was the victim of the Commune. The wretches who were massacred under the Commune in the cellar of the opera were not buried on this side. I will tell where their skeletons can be found in a spot not very far from the immense crypt which was stocked during the siege with all sorts of provisions. I came up this track when I was looking for the remains of the opera ghost, which I should never discovered before the unheard chance of described above. But we will return to the corpse and what ought to be done with it. For the present, I must conclude this very necessary introduction by thanking Miss Mifroid, who was the commissary of police called in for first investigating after the disappearance of Christine Daae, Monsieur Remy, the late secretary, Monsieur Mercier, the late acting manager, Monsieur Gabriel, the late chorus master, and more particularly Madame la Baronne de Castellote Barbezac, who was once the little Meg of the story, and who was not ashamed of it. The most charming star of our Admiral Corps de Ballet, the eldest daughter of the worthy Madame Giry, now deceased, who is in charge of the ghost's private box. All of these were great assistants to me, and thanks to them I shall be able to reproduce those hours of sheer love and terror in their smallest details before the reader's eyes. And I should be ungrateful indeed if I omitted, while standing on the threshold of this dreadful and voracious story, to thank the present management of the opera, which has so kindly assisted me in all of my inquiries, and Madame Messier in particular, together with Monsieur Gebion, the acting manager, and that the most amiable of men, the architect interested with the preservation of the building, who did not hesitate to lend me the work of Charles Garnier, although he was almost sure that I would never return to him. Lastly, I must pay a public tribute to the generosity of my friend and former collaborator, M.J. Le Creuset, who allowed me to dip into his splendid theatrical library and borrow the rarest edition of books, by which he set great scorn. Chapter 1. Visit the Ghost. It was the evening on which Mademoiselle Debienne and Poligny, the managers of the opera, were giving a last gala performance to mark their retirement. Suddenly, the dressing room of La Sorelli, one of the principal dancers, was invaded by half a dozen young ladies of the ballet, who had come up from the stage after dancing Poliest. They rushed in amid great confusion, some giving vent to forced and unnatural laughter, others to cries of terror. Sorelli, who wished to be alone for the moment to run through the speech which she was to make resigning managers, looked round angrily at the mad and tumultuous crowd. It was little Jamais, the girl with the tip-tilted nose and forget-me-not eyes, and the red rosy cheeks, and the lily-white neck and shoulders, who gave me the explanation, in a trembling voice. "It's the ghost!" And she locked the door. Sorelli's dressing room was fitted up with official, commonplace elegance. A pier glass, a sofa, a dressing table, a cupboard, or two provided necessary furniture. On the walls hung a few engravings, relics of the mother, who had known the glories of the old opera in the Rue de Peltier. Portraits of Vertis, Gardel, Dupont, and Biogtini. But the room seemed a place to those brats of the Corps de Ballet, who were lodged in common dressing rooms where they spent their time singing, quarreling, smacking the dressers and hairdressers, and buying one another glasses of cassier, beer, or even rum, until the call-boy's bell rang. Sorelli was very superstitious. She shuddered when she heard little Jamais speak of the ghost, called her a silly little fool, and then she was the first to believe in ghosts in general, and the opera ghost in particular. At once asked for details. "Have you seen him?" "As plainly as I see you now," said little Jamais, whose legs were giving way beneath her, and she dropped with a moan into the chair. Thereupon little Giry, the girl with eyes black as souls, hair black as ink, a swarthy complexion, and a poor little skin stretched over her poor bones, little Giry added, "If that's the ghost, he's very ugly." "Oh, yes," cried the chorus of ballet girls, and they all began to talk together. The ghost had appeared to them in the shape of a gentleman in dress clothes who had suddenly stood before them in the passage, without their knowing where he came from. He seemed to have come straight through the wall. "Pooh," one of them said, who had more or less kept her head. "You see the ghost everywhere." And it was true. For several months there had been nothing discussed of the opera but this ghost in dress clothes who stalked about the building, from top to bottom, like a shadow, who spoke to nobody, to whom nobody dared to speak, and who vanished as soon as he was seen, no one knowing how or where. As became a real ghost, he made no noise in walking. People began by laughing and making fun of the spectre dressed like a man of fashion or an undertaker, but the ghost legend soon swelled to enormous proportions among the Corps de Ballet. All the girls pretended to have met the supernatural being more or less often, and those who laughed the loudest were not the most at ease. When he did not show himself, he betrayed his presence or his passing by accident, comic or serious, for which general superstition held him responsible. Had anyone met with a fall or suffered practical joke at the hand of one of the other girls, or lost a powder puff, it was at once the fault of the opera ghost. After all, who had seen him? You met so many men in dress clothes at the opera who are not ghosts, but this dress suit had peculiarity of its own. It covered a skeleton, at least so the ballet girls said, and of course it had a death's head. Was all this serious? The truth is the idea of the skeleton came from the description of the ghost given by Joseph Bouquet, the chief scene-shifter, who had really seen the ghost. He had run up against the ghost on the little staircase by the footlights which leads to the cellars. He had seen him for a second, for the ghost had fled, and to anyone who cared to listen to him he said, "He is extraordinarily thin, and his dress coat hangs on a skeletal frame. His eyes are so deep that you can hardly see the fixed pupils. You just see two big black holes, as in a dead man's skull. His skin, which is stretched across bones like a drumhead, is not white, but a nasty yellow. His nose is so little worth talking about that you can't see its side face. And the absence of a nose is a horrible thing to look at. All the hair he has there are 4 long, dark, thick locks on his forehead and behind his ears." The chief scene-shifter was a serious, sober, steady man, very slow at imagining things. His words were received with interest and amazement, and soon there were other people to say that they had too met a man in dress clothes with a death's head on his shoulders. Sensible men, who had wind of the story, began saying that Joseph Bouquet had been a victim of a joke played by one of the assistants, and then, one after the other, there came a series of incidents so curious and so inexplicable that the very shrewdest people began to feel uneasy. For instance, a fireman is a brave fellow. He fears nothing, least of all fire. while the fireman in question, who had gone to make a round of inspection in the cellars, and who, it seems, had ventured a little farther than usual, suddenly reappeared on the stage, pale, scared, trembling, with his eyes staring out of his head, and practically faded into the arms of the proud mother of little Jamais. And why? Because he had seen coming toward him at the level of his head, but without a body attached to it, a head of fire. And, as I said, a fireman is not afraid of fire. The fireman's name was Pompey. The corps de ballet was flung into consternation. At first sight, this fiery head was in no way correspondent with Joseph Bouquet's description of the ghost, but the young ladies soon persuaded themselves that the ghost had several heads, which he changed about as he pleased. And of course, they at once imagined that they were in the greatest danger. Once a fireman did not hesitate to faint. Leaders and front row and back row girls alike had plenty of excuses for the fright that made them quicken their pace when passing some dark corner or ill-lit corridor. Sorelli herself, on the day after the adventure of the fireman, placed a horseshoe on the table in front of her stage doorkeeper's box, which everyone who entered the opera otherwise than a spectre must touch before setting foot on the first tread of staircase. This horseshoe was not invented by me, any more than any other part of this story, alas, and may still be seen in the table in the passage outside the stage doorkeeper's box, when you enter the opera through the court known as the Cour de l'Administration. To return to the evening in question. "It's the ghost," little Jamais had cried. An agonizing silence now regained in the dressing-room. Nothing was heard but the hard breathing of the girls. At last, Jamais, flinging herself upon the farthest corner of the wall, with every mark of real terror on her face, whispered, "Listen." Everybody seemed to hear a rustling outside the door. There was no sound of footsteps. It was like a light silk sliding over the panel, and then it stopped. Sorelli tried to show more pluck than others. She went up to the door and in a quavering voice asked, "Who's there?" But nobody answered. Then, feeling all eyes upon her, watching her last movement, she made an effort to show her courage and said very loudly, "Is there anyone behind that door?" "Oh, yes, yes, of course there is!" cried that little dried plum of Meg Giry, heroically holding Sorelli back by her gauze skirt. "Whatever you do, don't open the door! Oh, Lord, don't open the door!" Sorelli, armed with a dagger that never left her, turned the key and drew back the door, while the ballet girls retreated into the inner dressing-room, and Meg Giry sighed, "Mother, mother!" Sorelli looked into the passage for it. It was empty. A gas flame in its glass prison cast a red, suspicious light into the surrounding darkness, without succeeding in dispelling it. And the dancer slammed the door again with a deep sigh. "No," she said, "there is no one there." "Still, we saw him," Jamais declared, returning with the timid little steps to her place behind Sorelli. "He must be somewhere prowling about. I shan't go back to the dressing-room. We had better all go down to the foyer together at once for the speech, and we will come up again together." And the child reverently touched the little coral finger ring which she wore as a charm against bad luck, while Sorelli, stealthily, and with the tip of her pink right thumbnail, made a St. Andrew's cross on the wooden ring which adorned her fourth finger of her left hand. She said to the little ballet girls, "Come, children, pull yourselves together. I dare say no one has ever seen the ghost." "Yes, yes, we saw him. We just saw him now," cried the girls. "He had a death's head and a dress coat just like when he appeared to Joseph Bouquet." "And Gabriel saw him too," said Jamais. "Only yesterday afternoon in broad daylight." "Gabriel, the chorus master?" "Why, yes, didn't you know? And he was wearing his dress clothes in broad daylight." "Who, Gabriel?" "Why, no, the ghost." "Certainly, Gabriel told me himself. That's what he knew by him. Gabriel was in the stage manager's office. Suddenly the door opened and the Persian entered. You know the Persian has the evil eye." "Oh, yes," answered the little ballet girls in chorus, warding off ill luck by pointing their forefinger and little finger at the absent Persian, while their second and third fingers were bent on the palm and held down by the thumb. "And you know how superstitious Gabriel is," continued Jamais. "However, he was always polite. When he meets the Persian, he just puts his hand in his pocket and touches his keys. Well, the moment the Persian appeared in the doorway, Gabriel gave one jump from his chair to unlock the cupboard so as to touch iron. In doing so, he tore a whole skirt of his overcoat on a nail. Hurrying to get out of the room, he banged his forehead against the hat peg and gave himself a huge bump. Then, suddenly stepping back, he skinned his arm on the screen near the piano. He tried to lean on the piano, but the lid fell on his hands and crushed his fingers. He rushed off to the office like a madman, Slipped on the staircase and came down to a whole first flight on his back. I was just passing with Mother. We picked him up. He was covered with bruises and his face was all over blood. We were frightened out of our lives, but all at once he began to thank Providence that he had gotten off so cheaply. Then he told us what had frightened him. He had seen the ghost behind the Persian. The ghost with the death's head, just like Joseph Bouquet's description. Jamais had told her story ever so quickly, as though the ghost were at her heels and was quite out of breath at the finish. As a silence followed, while Sorelli polished her nails in great excitement, it was broken by little Giry, who said, "Joseph Bouquet would do better to hold his tongue." "Why should he hold his tongue?" asked somebody. "That's Mother's opinion," replied Meg, lowering her voice and looking all about as though fearing lest other ears, those present, might overhear. "And why is it your Mother opinions?" "Hush! Mother says the ghost doesn't like being talked about." "And why does your Mother say so?" Because... nothing." This reticence exasperated the curiosity of the ladies, who crowded round little Giry, begging her to explain herself. They were there, side by side, leaning forward simultaneously, in one movement of entreaty and fear, communicating their terror to one another, taking a keen pleasure in feeling their blood freeze in their veins. "I swore not to tell," gasped Meg. But they left her no peace and promised to keep the secret until Meg, burning to say all she knew, began, with her eyes fixed on the door. "Well, it's because of the private box." "What private box?" "The ghost's box." "Has the ghost a box? Oh, do tell us, do tell us." "Not so loud," said Meg. "It's box 5, you know, the box on the grand tier, next to the stage box on the left." "Oh, nonsense!" "I tell you it is. Mother has charge of it, but you swear you won't say a word?" Of course, of course." "Well, that's the ghost box. No one has had it for over a month except the ghost, and orders have been given at the box office that it must never be sold." "And does the ghost really come there?" "Yes." "Then somebody does come." "Why, no, the ghost comes, but there is nobody there." The little ballet girls exchanged glances. If the ghost came to the box, he must be seen, because he wore a dress coat and a death's head. This is what they tried to make Meg understand, but she replied, "That's just it. The ghost is not seen, and he had no dress coat and no head. All that talk about his death's head and his head of fire is nonsense. There's nothing in it. You only hear him when he's in the box." "Mother has never seen him, but she has heard him. Mother knows, because she gives him his program." Sorelli interfered. "Giry, child, you're getting at us." Thereupon little Giry began to cry. "I ought to know, to hell with my tongue, if Mother ever came to know. But I was quite right. Joseph Bouquet had no business to talk of things that don't concern him. It will bring bad luck. Mother was saying so last night." There was a sound of hurried and heavy footsteps in the passage, and a breathless voice cried, "Cecile! Cecile, are you there?" It's Mother's voice," said Jamais. "What's the matter?" She opened the door. A respectable lady, built on the lines of Pomeranian grandeur, burst into the dressing room and dropped groaning into a vacant armchair. Her eyes rolled madly in her brick-dust-colored face. "How awful!" she said. "How awful!" What? "Joseph Bouquet." "What about him?" "Joseph Bouquet is dead." The room became filled with exclamations, with astonished outcries and scared requests for explanations. "Yes, he was found hanging in the third-floor cellar." "It's the ghost!" little Giry blurted, as though in spite of herself. But she at once corrected herself with her hands pressed to her mouth. No, I didn't say it. All around her, her panic-stricken companions repeated under their breaths, "Yes, it must be the ghost." Sorelli was very pale. "I shall never be able to recite my speech," she said. Ma Jamais gave her opinion, while she emptied a glass of liquor that happened to be standing on the table. The ghost must have something to do with it. The truth is that no one will ever know how Joseph Bouquet met his death. The verdict at the inquest was natural suicide. In his Memoirs of a Manager, Monsieur Montcarmont, one of the joint managers who succeeded in Monsieur Demnay and Poligny, describes the incident as follows. A grievous accident spoiled the little party in which Messieurs Demnay and Poligny gave to celebrate their retirement. I was in the manager's office when Mercier, the acting manager, suddenly came darting in. He seemed half mad and told me that the body of the scene shifter had been found hanging in the third cellar under the stage, between a farmhouse and a scene from Roy de la Horre. I shouted, "Come cut him down!" By the time I had rushed down the staircase and the Jacob's ladder, the man was no longer hanging from the rope. Though this is an event which Monsieur Montcalm thinks natural. A man hangs at the end of a rope, they go to cut him down, the rope has disappeared. Oh, Monsieur Montcalm found a very simple explanation. Listen to him. It was just after the ballet. The leaders and dancing girls lost no time in taking their precautions against the evil eye. There you are! Picture the corpse de ballet scuttling down the Jacob's ladder and dividing the suicide's rope among themselves in less time it takes to write. Well, when, on the other hand, I think of the exact spot where the body was discovered, the third cellar under the stage, I imagine that somebody must have been interested in seeing that that rope disappeared after it had effected its purpose. And time will show if I'm wrong. The horrid news suddenly spread all over the opera, where Joseph Bouquet was very popular. The dressing rooms emptied, and the ballet girls crowded around Sorelli like timid sheep around their sheep herders, made for the foyer through the ill-lit passages and staircases, trotting as fast as their little pink legs could carry them.